Um, Welcome to Frontline program by the Sbey Research Center, where we bring together leading scholars, economists, and intellectual to engage with the most important questions, political and economic questions of our time. Today, we are honored to host one of the most distinguished Marxist political economists, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. Professor has presented some of the most difficult and uncompromising critics of capitalist development and imperial dominations, on the deepening contradictions of the neoliberal order. Professor, welcome to our program. In today's conversations, we would like to have conversations with Professor Patnaik about the ongoing conflict between Iran and US and Israel. So we would like to start with the questions, Professor Patnaik. From your perspective, as a Marxist political economist, how do you theorize the Iran-Israel-US conflict?
Most people have seen this conflict, the US-Israeli assault on Iran, in geopolitical terms. Now, of course, there is a geopolitical dimension to it. I'm not denying it, but it seems to me that this conflict is really rooted in a serious crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Let us not forget that the assault on Iran comes on the back of an assault on Venezuela, of Trump's tariff aggression. In other words, it is really part of a whole chain of events, all of which, to my mind, point towards an effort on the part of US imperialism to recolonize the third world, to recolonize the global south. The means of this recolonization, of course, differ from one place to another. And we know that, for instance, there is an imminent attack on Cuba, which no previous US imperialist administration had dared to do. So obviously, this is really reflecting a much more serious issue rather than simply a geopolitical conflict. And that issue, to my mind, revolves around an attempt to recolonize the third world. Now, why is it necessary for US imperialism at the present moment to recolonize the third world? I believe that neoliberal capitalism is, of course, going through a serious crisis. The crisis has two aspects. One, which is pretty clear, is that there has been an enormous increase in income inequality during the period of neoliberal capitalism. That is because of the fact that capital has become globally mobile, while labor is not. Trade unions are still organized along national lines, and therefore, in effect, the bargaining strength of labor vis-à-vis capital has gone down greatly. Even workers in the advanced capitalist countries are now tied to their fortunes are tied to third world labor reserves. And of course, the third world labor reserves are not shrinking despite the relocation of capital to the third world. So you have all over the world a shift from working people towards the economic surplus. And this shift is something which is responsible for generating an overproduction crisis, because obviously the out of the economic surplus, if a dollar is transferred into the economic surplus from the worker's income, then of course, out of the economic surplus, it doesn't get immediately consumed, while out of the worker's income, that dollar would have got consumed. So you have a tendency towards a suppression of consumption demand, and therefore a tendency towards overproduction. That is one part of the crisis. But the second part of the crisis, which people have generally not talked about, and that part of the crisis consists in the fact that in the entire post-Second World War period, the period of hegemony of US imperialism, US has not had the access to colonial plunder and loot the way that British or French imperialism earlier had. Basically, in the heyday of colonialism, which was before the First World War, because the interwar period was a period in which was a period of transition. In the heyday of colonialism, which was a form of imperialism before the First World War, you actually had huge amounts of loot, which Indian nationalist anti-colonial writers called the drain of surplus, that a whole lot of transfer took place from the colonies without any quid pro quo, without any return for it. It was simply looted. And this loot really provided Britain, who was the leading imperial power of that time, the means to balance its payments. Britain ran a current and capital account deficit on its balance of payments vis-a-vis all the newly industrializing regions of that period, vis-a-vis continental Europe, vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis South Africa, vis-a-vis other regions to which capitalism was spreading. But this deficit was made good because of or through the loot from the colonies. Now, in the post-Second World War period, there has been no such similar loot. And as a result, what you have is that the US has managed to retain its leading role in the imperial world, but in the process, it has printed dollars for the rest of the world to accumulate. In other words, what Britain had done by taking money from the colonies, the US has done by simply getting indebted to the rest of the world and printing dollars, because of which you have trillions of dollars now hanging around in the world economy. And this is something which actually poses an extremely serious challenge to the international financial system. The challenge is normally seen in terms of de-dollarization and some other currency taking over. But I think the challenge is not just in some other currency taking over. It is, in fact, a challenge where suddenly if there's a shift to commodities, suppose for some reason there is a loss of confidence in the dollar and people begin to shift to commodities. Oil would be the natural commodity to shift to. Suppose people start buying oil futures. In that case, oil prices would rise. And we know what the effect of oil prices rising would be. Recently, we saw in the case of the Iran war, and we are still seeing that if oil prices rise, the stock markets collapse, that you actually have a financial crisis. Therefore, the threat that arises because of large amounts of dollars being held in the world economy arises not just because the dollar can be substituted by some other currency, but because of the fact that the dollar can be substituted by some commodity, notably oil, and if that happens, it's a very serious threat to the financial system of the world. Therefore, the United States, as the leading imperialist country, wants to protect the position of the dollar by making sure that such an eventuality does not happen. And its control over the third world helps it to avert such an eventuality in a number of ways. Firstly, it is actually Venezuela is the largest has the largest oil reserves in the world. Iran is an oil producer. So it is the US is actually, in a sense, controlling the entire world's oil, or the bulk of the world's oil. The attack on Iraq was basically meant with that intention. So if you control the bulk of the world's oil, then you can make sure that oil prices do not suddenly rise. Okay. Secondly, you can also make sure that as a medium of circulation, oil transactions, which is the most important primary commodity in the world, keep occurring in terms of dollars. Thirdly, you can also make sure that there is a certain loot of the global south that can take place, because most of the oil producing countries are in the global south, and thereby that sustains the US balance of payments. So this is basically one way that Trump thinks and US imperialism thinks that they can actually stabilize the financial system of the world, of the capitalist world, by acquiring control over the third world, especially the third world's oil reserves.
Great. It sounds very good. I very like this analyzing of the ongoing conflict. So, in one sentence, would you say that the conflict, the ongoing conflict, is in the direction or is in kind of the struggle or fighting over regional dominations? For example, US try to control the global south by controlling the oil countries?
You see this, as I was saying, that that the world capitalist economy is currently is in a very serious crisis.
Mhm.
Now, this crisis is one which cannot be, it's a crisis of neoliberal capitalism, but
Yeah.
it cannot be resolved within neoliberal capitalism. Why? If you look at the overproduction crisis, Keynesianism had told us, John Maynard Keynes had suggested that you can have state intervention to
Mhm.
boost aggregate demand, in which case any problem of overproduction can be resolved through larger government spending. And
Mhm.
larger government spending can be on welfare expenditures, which is what left liberals generally demanded, and in Europe largely succeeded under the kind of rule of social democracy in introducing many welfare state measures, or it can be on military expenditures. In the United States, for instance, militarism has played the role in boosting aggregate demand, as, for instance, people like Baran and Sweezy have argued in their book, Monopoly Capital. So the point is that, Keynes had suggested that you can actually have state intervention in demand management so that the problem of overproduction crisis is no longer a serious one. But finance capital is always opposed to any state intervention of this kind. How can state intervention introduce demand? Suppose the state spends $100 and raises these $100 by taxing the workers. The workers would have spent these $100 anyway. So there is no addition to demand. There would be an addition to demand only if the state spending is financed either by a fiscal deficit, in which case you're not taxing anybody, simply printing money, or alternatively, if it is financed by taxing the rich who save or who do not consume a large part of what they give as taxes, so that some of these taxes come at the expense of savings, but they are spent by the government. Suppose government spends $100, taxes the rich $100, then their consumption may go down by 50, but their savings go down by 50. Therefore, there's a net increase in demand of $50. Now, therefore, the only way that state intervention can work is if state intervention is financed through either a fiscal deficit or through taxing the rich. The first countries during the interwar period who overcame the depression were Japan and Germany, the fascist countries, and they did so by increasing military expenditures in preparation for the war and financing it through massive increases in the fiscal deficit. Now, today, what we have is, as I said, finance capital is always opposed to a fiscal deficit. But at that time, finance capital was national. It was the German finance capital, the Japanese finance capital, and therefore these fascist governments and so on could persuade their nation-based finance capitals not to raise objections to the increase in state expenditures. But today, finance capital is international. Therefore, suppose any country decides to do a Keynesian demand management, then that country would find an outflow of finance. Look what happened in Britain when Liz Truss, the British Prime Minister, actually, her Chancellor of the Exchequer, her finance minister, presented in the British Parliament a plan for enlarging the fiscal deficit to subsidize the rich in Britain. Even then, the very fact of the enlargement of the fiscal deficit meant that finance started flowing out of Britain. The pound sterling collapsed, and therefore Liz Truss had to resign and became the shortest prime minister in the entire history of Britain. So the point is that today finance is globalized. And therefore, no nation state, no individual nation state would be able to adopt Keynesian measures. Therefore, what you have is really a situation where Keynesianism is not possible. You cannot resolve the overproduction crisis of neoliberal capitalism, which has manifested itself in much larger levels of unemployment in the entire capitalist world within neoliberal capitalism itself. And this is clear from Trump's measures. His tariff aggression is actually a means of generating larger employment within the United States by opting out of neoliberal capitalism, while he wants the rest of the world to remain stuck with neoliberal capitalism. In other words, he wants India to open up its goods to American markets with no tariffs, but he wants to impose tariffs on Indian goods. So he actually wants a situation of really rescuing the US economy from the crisis of neoliberal capitalism by imposing a one-way withdrawal from it for the US while all the others remain stuck within it.
Great. Well, let's move to China in this conflict. Professor, how do you see the China's positions in this conflict, in the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel and USA? So do you see the China as a good mediator? Do you think China, they have a more plus than minus in that conflict?
You know, many people see China as a potentially imperialist country on a par with the United States, and actually they see China's support for, let's say, Iran as an act of imperialism, and therefore they see the current world as being divided, as Lenin would have put it, into inter-imperialist rivalry between US and China and so on. I don't agree with it. In fact, the Chinese intervention is simply on a much smaller scale anywhere. As a matter of fact, I would argue the other way around. I would actually criticize China for not intervening sufficiently as a counter-hegemonic force against the United States. For instance, when the United States pushed through that resolution on Gaza of setting up some kind of an administrative unit in which Trump has put Tony Blair and others, China and Russia abstained. They actually, in a sense, handed over the running of Gaza to the United States through a Security Council resolution. So I think China has, if anything, been a rather timid country in countering the hegemonic ambitions, or as I said, the recolonizing ambitions of the United States. So far from a Chinese imperialism, I would actually fault China for not being bold enough in counteracting the imperialist schemes.
Well, it sounds very good. What about India? India is the second large country in the Southeast Asia.
No, but you see, India at the moment is governed by what I would call a neo-fascist administration.
Mhm.
The current Indian government is one which belongs to a political party whose roots lie in a project of building a Hindu state. In other words, this is not the anti-colonial struggle's promise. The promise of the anti-colonial struggle was to build a state in India, a nation state that would actually be secular, that's in our constitution, where every citizen, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, gender, and so on, would have equal rights and so on. Now, the present government, while paying lip service to that idea, after all, they are operating within that constitution, is actually in practice kind of, informed by an ambition of building eventually a Hindu state. And therefore, but at the same time, like all fascist outfits, it wishes to other the Muslim minority while at the same time carrying out the agenda of monopoly capital. There has been no more pro-monopoly government in the country than what we have at present. It's completely neoliberal, it's completely pro-monopoly, and of course it is a neo-fascist government in trying to other a religious minority and also using extremely repressive measures. So the fact that India has this obviously has also meant that Indian foreign policy is much more pro-Israel, much more pro-United States, and so on. In other words, I'm not saying that they have, but compared to the way that India historically always stood with the Palestinian people,
Mhm.
it always stood with the third world countries. It always stood against, with countries like Iran. It always stood against Israeli settler colonialism. There is a very significant shift. Not that they have completely abandoned the old positions, but they have tried within the old position to shift as close as possible to Israel. You may have noticed that the Indian Prime Minister visited Israel just before the February 28 attack on Iran, because of which I think India has also managed to marginalize itself in the entire third world, because of which the BRICS has become somewhat dormant and inactive, and because of which India also is not in a position to intervene the way it could in the old days.
Great, Professor. We have two more questions. How do you see the positions of Israel in let's say, imagine in post-conflict Iran? Do you see Israel as one of the regional power, or kind to be one of the great power in the world?
Sorry, I couldn't catch that. Could you speak a bit louder?
Yeah, I mean, how do you see the positions of Israel in the post-conflict of Iran, when the conflict with Iran is done? So how do you see the positions of Israel in this conflict?
You see, the Israeli issue. Israel is a simple, pure case of settler colonialism. Exactly the way that you had, for instance, in South Africa, you had in the United States, you had in Canada, and so on. You actually had European migrants going and displacing the local Indian population, taking over their land, and so on. I think Israeli settler colonialism is something which poses a major threat to the entire Middle East. But Israeli settler colonialism is aligned with US imperialism. You, of course, cannot have a settler colonialism that is independent of the dominant imperialist powers. Therefore,
Yes.
you actually have the US Israeli axis, in which the alliance runs along the following lines: that you allow us the set to carry on with our settler colonialism project, and we would be your instruments in the Middle East for bringing about regime change and for bringing about the institution of new regimes that would generally kowtow to imperialism. And this is exactly what you find is happening in Iran. And this is something which Israeli occupation of Lebanon, Israeli occupation which has been going on for a very long time, including in the West Bank and so on, is all about. And I think it really poses it poses an extremely serious danger to the to world peace, because settler colonialism in the 19th century is something which one hoped was a thing of the past, but you cannot have settler colonialism in the 20th and 21st centuries, and people being marginalized, genocide being committed against them, and so on in this day and age.
Great. My last question, Professor. So, as a consequences, do you see the reorganizing or reordering international economic controlling positions of the U.S.? So, do you think the U.S. they are trying to use this conflict to reorder the international economy?
Well, I mean, the way I see it, in fact, many people think in terms of a new world order that might emerge with the replacement of the United States, displacement of the United States, with countries like China occupying an important position in it. I don't think that is something which is either possible or even desirable. I
Mhm.
don't think that simply a replacement of US by China is a desirable thing. I think it's very important for countries of the third world not to be dollar dependent, not to be neoliberal, not to be trapped in this neoliberal regime that allows free capital flows and free trade flows, but in fact to have a home market based development. In other words, let us say a large country like India should have a home market based development, which basically means that the basis for development should be an expansion of the home market. And the home market obviously is provided by millions of peasants, and therefore a rise in peasant incomes, therefore a rise in the output of peasant agriculture. That would, of course, also mean that the development is more broad-based. The development is more evenly distributed. Now,
Mhm.
of course, there are many countries which are very small. And for small countries, therefore, it would become necessary to come together in order to form blocks, like the European Union or something, in order to form blocks in which then these blocks can have home market based development. Now, of course, let's say a country like India, which doesn't have enough oil, cannot have an entirely home market based development, because you'll have to export some goods to the oil producing countries in order to import oil. But I think even that should be done on the basis of bilateral trade agreements in which those countries in turn are allowed to buy goods from India, whatever they wish to have from India, instead of this multilateral arrangement where we pay them in terms of dollars and then we have to earn these dollars. We don't manage to earn enough dollars. Therefore, we have to borrow from the IMF or from the World Bank, and therefore they impose conditionalities. All that should be out. In fact, we should have bilateral arrangements for obtaining those commodities in which we are deficient, but otherwise it should be a home market based development. I think that is the future that I visualize for mankind, and also that is the only future in which you can actually have uh, generally widespread even development. You see, for instance, people talk about India being one of the faster growing economies under neoliberalism, but under neoliberalism, not only has income inequality increased dramatically, but in fact, absolute poverty, defined in terms of nutritional deprivation, now afflicts a larger proportion of the population, both in urban and rural India, than it did earlier. So I think this entire strategy has proved to be wrong, and therefore we have to think of an alternative.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Patnaik. Thank you for your very informative conversations. And again, we are very grateful for your time. We appreciate your kind analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.